Shomer, Part 2. Intermittently, like wind through window cracks, wailing floated down the hall and through the door. The clatter came almost regularly every 5 or 6 minutes. Every time it startled Marty, made him look up, but mostly because whenever it stopped, he thought he heard rustling again, just for a second. Then Marty would glance at the dark bathroom or over to the door he hadn't opened, the one almost completely blocked by the bookcase. But he made himself stay put. This was his post. He was sure of it. Almost sure. Much later, the drawing not done but shaped, Marty put his pad aside, considered doing a solo boggle round in Elle's honor. The idea, though, of clattering the lettered dice cubes in their little cage in the suffocating near silence unnerved him. He reached for a Tanakh open to the Psalms, but those proved less than soothing, strangely savage. Almost none were about grief or even comfort. Mostly they were brutal or heartbroken. You break the teeth of the wicked. I am a stranger to my brothers, an alien to my kin. It is for your sake that we are slain all day long. But after a while, the words did seem to knit themselves together before his eyes, form a sort of blanket or gauze that Marty could feel wrapping him. Maybe the Psalms really did have power, to keep too much of himself from bleeding away, or else to hold at an almost safe distance his dawning understanding of what other people's deaths, even more than one's own, really mean to the living. You are my help and my rescuer. Do not delay. He had no idea how he fell asleep or for how long, but the screaming woke him up. Heart thundering, he lurched up, swaying, clenching his fists as the screams silenced themselves. His eyes shot to the blue curtains, then to the door behind the bookcase. He'd failed, let his guard down, and now Uncle El... With a cry, he moved toward the bookcase, intending to shove it aside so he could get through that second door. But a new round of rattling stopped him in his tracks. He held still, listening not to the rattle, but for the moment just after it. The rustling. And there it was. Or was it? Was that even a sound? Abruptly he turned, walked out into the hall. A wail greeted him, piercing, shot through with breath. Again he felt behind and all around him for the light switch, couldn't find it. Only after a few seconds did he realize there were more sounds. Not rattling exactly, but clicking, sliding sounds, and murmurs. He was almost sure he could hear murmurs now. Exhaling long and low, and with a single uncertain glance back into the Shomer room, Marty started down the hall into the dark. He could smell the open doorways when he passed them. Antiseptic, pine-scented wax, metal. His knee bumped a gurney, sending it squeaking a few feet ahead until it bumped something, the open coffin, and caused Marty to freeze, his own hairs crawling up his back, shoulders hunching as though he expected to be grabbed. Edging more toward what he assumed was the center of the hall, he continued on. Only when he'd reached the T at the very end did Marty start to see light. Only a little, and far to his left. A strip of flickerless yellow under the bottom of a closed door. He waited until the next round of rattling, the murmuring that accompanied it. It was coming from right there. Breathing through pursed lips as though that might slow his heart, Marty moved toward the light. He stopped outside the door. The sounds weren't actually intermittent, not here. There were constant sliding noises, clicks and taps, very occasional muttering. Marty flung the door open. As one, the three Chinese men leapt to their feet, mahjong tiles spilling off their holders and scattering across the table. All these men were old, in fact. Two in jeans and neatly tucked button-up shirts, plus the white-robed man who'd let Marty into the funeral home. The surprise on that man's face looked completely incongruous, brand new, and almost lost, as if it had wandered onto the wrong face by mistake. Mr. Burnt, the man started, then corrected himself. Marty, Mr. Marty, did you need something? Behind and above them another wail bloomed, much closer, much harder to listen to from here, operatic in its anguish. Marty waited until it finished. The men still stood, staring. All he could think to ask was, "What are you guys doing?" Though he couldn't have been sure, Marty thought the look they all exchanged had amusement in it. Certainly, it was kind. "The same as you, I think," said the white-haired man, "in our way." "Shomering?" That is not what we call it, but it's not what we call it either, Marty said, slipping into an exhausted, lonely smile. I don't think. The wail again. Again, Marty waited until it passed. She's with you, isn't she? He asked. The old guy on the left nodded. He had a red ribbon pinned to his shirt and some sort of outlandishly large belt buckle. She is performing her part. We perform ours. I'm sorry for your loss, said Marty. We are sorry for yours. Need a fourth? He asked, earning himself a set of strangely satisfying, startled glances. The only way the moment might have been better would be if El had taught Marty the game, but that had been his grandfather, years and years ago. The white-haired man smiled. You know how to play? I'd need a card. Card? Then understanding dawned on the white-haired man's face. He shook his head. Again, he looked kind. Ah, of course. Jew Mahjong. Entirely different game. His companions were nodding too. The guy with the belt buckle said, completely different, very frustrating. So few ways to win, so many to lose. Yet again, Marty felt tears well in his eyes, his uncle's absence seeping in. Yep, he said, sounds like a Jewish game, all right. He left them to it. Not until he reached the tee and turned into the dark corridor did he hear the rustling. Much louder now, even though it was coming from way down at the end of the hall, from the closed room where he should have been sitting, where El lay helpless. Ignoring the dark, the coffin on the wall, the warnings shooting off in his brain, that grip again seizing both his arms, Marty shot down the corridor. When he reached the door to the Shomer room, he paused for a split second, long enough to make sure, to hope he'd been wrong again, but there was no mistaking it this time. The rustling. He pushed open the door, half expecting full dark, but the light was as he'd left it. So was the couch, the open Tanakh, the Elijah glass on the table, his sketch pad with El's half-formed face. Of course it was, because El wasn't in here. He was back there, unguarded, where Marty had abandoned him. Marty strode straight to the other side of the room, reached over the bookcase, twisted the doorknob, which was cold like a fistful of ice, and shoved at the door, scrambling atop and over the bookcase as he pushed. Then he really did freeze, stopped scrambling, blinking, breathing. He held absolutely still, or let himself be held. Later, when he had time to think about it, he decided that was more accurate, because he really could feel that grip on his arms and around his waist. Even more, he knew that grip, but he couldn't let himself process it yet. On a gurney, in the center of a blank, tiled, windowless, featureless room, under a single white sheet that covered neither his face nor his feet, lay Uncle El. Frigid air poured down over him, a fall of faintly glowing blue like an iceberg calving. The blue swept and swirled around him, nuzzled along his chest as though cuddling up or sniffing for signs of life. Constantly it washed away, but then reformed in the air. Marty hovered in that doorway for barely a blink, less than a second, just long enough to realize that air, no matter how cold, doesn't glow or have any sort of head, let alone that long, wolf-like sniffing thing atop El's chest. And that whatever lights there were in this room, they weren't on. And that the blueness hunched on El's chest was turning now, right toward Marty. Then he felt himself yanked backward, falling over the bookcase and landing hard on his ass on the floor of the Shomer room, the door swinging shut. Had he done that? As he scrambled to his feet, turned to run, turned back, thought of his uncle, nearly collapsed in a flood of guilt, and then grabbed for the couch as the guilt drained out of him as quickly as it had come. He could feel that grip on his shoulders again, turning him toward the hallway, could feel the push in his back, the weight so familiar, El's hands. Staggering forward, he threw open the door and ran smack into Robbie the Blank, who had just reached it, the Chinese man in white flowing behind him. In there, Marty babbled, shaking, pointing as his overweight and preternaturally becalmed cousin drew him to the couch, sat him down. It's in there. Of course it is, said Robbie, as though he knew. Of course he is, said the Chinese man. You did not go in, did you? It's so cold. To protect the body. Marty started to argue, wanted to protest, to grab them both, to scream. But the understanding he'd already had was spreading through him now. No, nothing so grand or certain as understanding. But he knew what he'd seen. He could hear it in there, still, though he was sure the Chinese man would say it was simply the sound of the air. He let Robbie pour him a glass of water and drank it. The liquid tasted tepid, flat, so plain and of this world, and it warmed him like whiskey. Robbie even gave Marty his car keys, saying he'd arranged for his own ride home. Moments later, Marty was out in the still drizzly gray of early morning, watching the wet drip off the poplar trees. He sat for a long time in Robbie's car, thinking of Robbie down there in that room, of Elle in the room beside him, standing guard. Because that was it, wasn't it? Maybe. It made a sort of sense. How Jewish, really, to provide an opportunity for one last mitzvah, performed not for the dead, but by them, for the living. During the week of his grandfather's Shiva, Marty had asked every one of his older relatives why all the mirrors had been soaped over, and he'd gotten a different answer every time. Because we should not be thinking of ourselves this week. Because we can no longer see what your grandfather saw. It was Robbie's father, Marty realized, who had said, because the angel of death was just here, and he might still be close, and you don't want him to see you. He'd said that winking, but not quite as if he were kidding. And if Marty was right, and really had seen what he'd seen in that room, then the blue thing, angel of death, whatever it was right where it was supposed to be, because Elle was keeping it there, and away, therefore, from anyone else whose grief and pain might draw it. No wonder immediate family couldn't be Shomerim. Their wounds were too raw, too easily detected. The dead would be too weak to hold the angel's attention. But a nephew, perhaps, or a friend. Someone at risk, but not quite as much risk. Someone the dead or the memory of them might still be able to help, to push for just a little longer out of harm's way. Marty's tears were quiet ones now. Not bothering to wipe his face, he set Robbie's car in motion and drove through the empty streets to Elle's house, where the first well-wishers had already arrived, and where they'd all spend the next week eating kugel on paper plates, gathering in quiet corners, telling Elle stories all day long, under mirrors carefully soaped to spare his uncle's loved ones for those first awful days, their first true glimpse of the world without him in it. Thank you.